Two people have been living in you all your life. One is the ego, garrulous, demanding, hysterical, and calculating. The other is the hidden spiritual being whose still voice of wisdom you have only rarely heard or attended to. So, welcome back, everybody, to the podcast where we're going to discuss the king and queen baby, which is within us all and is far, far more potent in some people, which we're going to learn about today. In psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud coined the phrase, Her Majesty, the baby, to describe an inborn infantile attitude that exists inside the adult human psyche. We all know people like this, in fact. Later addiction and emotional recovery, pioneered by doctors Harry Tiebout and others, helped us see how this exact inner archetype of the king and queen baby stays alive in adults. And we still have tantrums at 40. Whether we label it the king baby or the queen baby, we are talking about the infantile ego. It is that unconscious, childish part of us that demands immediate gratification, throwing silent or sometimes very loud tantrums when reality does not bend to our will. If you've ever felt stuck in emotional distress, repeating the same relationship patterns, for example, hitting walls in your career, struggling with anxiety, depression, or addiction, this inner archetype is almost certainly operating behind the scenes, and you need to become aware of it. The paradox of control and surrender is an important topic when learning about the king and queen baby archetypes. The type of people who throw tantrums are selfish, cluster B styled kings and queens who actually can't manage their thoughts. They can't manage their emotions. And they are very, very bad at self-regulation. They also expect the world of others and have egos the size of the Empire State Building. So in true emotional healing, we talk endlessly about surrender, as you know. In fact, it's obviously one of the very first steps of getting your life back together. Surrender, letting go of control, things like that. We talk about stepping out of the driver's seat and aligning with something greater. A program, a still voice of wisdom, a higher power, God, or simply the reality of life on life's terms, the reality of things as they are, not as we sort of demand them to be on our sort of golden thrones. Surrender, though, requires one fundamental prerequisite, and that's willingness, the complete acceptance of powerlessness. In other words, if you're not able to action, power means action. If you're not able to action the life you want, the job and careers and so on, you might have to accept a sense of powerlessness. It's obviously very apt with alcoholics who have just got to admit that they are powerless over their addictions and their emotions and substances and so on. And it breaks through denial. So let's ask questions. Are you powerless over your emotions? Have you tried to manipulate, fight, or think your way out of emotional patterns yourself, only to find yourself getting worse or staying stuck in the exact same loop? And then we need to ask ourselves what we can do about all of this today. How can we get out of acting like adult children? Adult children are ugly and no one wants them. So at some point we need to grow up and can no longer remain Peter Pan's king and queen babies. We must grow up, own up, show up, and take personal accountability for ourselves. At some point, we can't act like a child forever. It's just not what life will allow. So many of us can logically see our unmanageability. We read the self-help books, we attend therapy, we start the paradigm process program, and we analyze our past in some way. But seeing powerlessness within ourselves is not the same as accepting it. Awareness first, sure, but acceptance, that's a whole another story. Our ego fights back. Our defenses, especially if we're not mentally regulated, if we're not emotionally regulated, our ego fights back, and it'll fight back to the death sometimes if we're not careful. It'll fight back to the point of self-harm, of harming family, your own children, your own mother and father, and spouse, husband or wife. That's how bad um, the logic is with the king or queen baby. So when things fall apart, a queen baby finds someone else to blame. Very, very important. First the denial, then the blame. So when things get difficult, when there's pressure, when people are squeezed, a king or queen baby finds someone else to blame. It could be parents, partners, therapists, all the world. It's either black or white. Often with the king or queen baby, it's like all good in the beginning, and then it's all bad. There's very little gray area. So you'll hear them singing someone's praises 1 minute, and the next minute, they're persecuting that person, and the person's terrible and bad, and I didn't realize. And along with that comes the drama and the gossip and the distraction from their own problems so that they can focus on other people rather than fixing themselves. And this is why they haven't grown up, because the focus is not on the self. So ask yourself honestly, what is the common denominator in all your past struggles? Your relationships. What's the common denominator? What's the common issue with failed attempts at therapy or repeated emotional breakdowns? Is it them? Honestly, no. Or is it the demanding inner child that refuses to yield? Before we can move forward, just pause and identify the real emotional baggage that you have. There's 8 primary emotions here that drive your own unmanageability today. Rage, definitely. Shame, panic, resentment, big one, the biggest. Self-pity, being a victim, victims of violent people. Terror, jealousy at 7, chronic loneliness at 8. Chronic loneliness. You're unable to connect. So name these things, acknowledge them. That is where your real work of getting that inner child to catch a wake up begins. Rage, shame, panic, resentment and self-pity, terror, jealousy, or chronic loneliness. So now when we're dealing with king or queen babies, we're going to deal with people who are high in impulsivity and interpersonal conflict. There's emotional dysregulation that you can see a mile off. They often call themselves empaths. And a lot of the time, they're nothing of the sort. They're on the more narcissistic scale of the spectrum, antisocial perhaps. Other traits are deceitfulness, irresponsibility, a lack of remorse. They don't take accountability. They don't care how other people feel. They're too busy blaming and, mistreating and rationalizing. So it just doesn't happen. There's no accountability. There's no cooling off and growing, thinking, what have I done here? Should have been, doesn't happen. So what should have the other person done? How dare they do this? How could they not give me the money I asked for? I'm only 45, living in my parents' home or in their rented apartment that they pay for, but how dare they not give me more money? So that's a good example of a king or queen baby. There's often a pattern of splitting, which is that black and white. they're perfect or they're terrible. They have their own identity disturbance, and they try and stay away from people seeing it by jumping up and down. I call it monkey mind, by acting like monkeys. And if they don't get their way, they jump up and down. They threaten self-harm, suicide. Um, they'll pick up often an eating, uh, emotional eating issue, a substance issue, sexual issue, relationships. They'll act without care or safety. They'll go into risky relationships and so on and so forth. So inappropriate behavior, shallow emotions, and theatrics, that's for sure. Theatrics are a big one. So now we move on to the anatomy of what I call the anatomy of the queen baby, to understand why this childish ego exists in so many people, especially with substance abuse, with emotional issues, and so on. We have to trace it back to where it all began, which of course is in the womb. In the womb, you experienced total security, warmth, and a sense of power. Every need was met without effort, without your effort at least. You were literally the absolute center of the universe. When you were born into infancy, that illusion continued for a while until we're around about 2 years old. When we cry, food arrives on time. When we whimper, we held. But that doesn't last forever, of course. As healthy development occurs, a child gradually learns that the world does not revolve around them. They build frustration, anger, no tolerance for not getting their way. Um, on the one side, if they don't grow, and on the other, they build self-regulation, boundaries, and of course, high tolerance for stress. So when we experience trauma, neglect, chaotic environments, for sure, divorce, physical growth continues. But it's the emotional growth, the EQ, that is stunted or stops. So we become grown adults walking around in adult bodysuits, controlled by a demanding, frightened infant inside. So that's the king or queen baby. And now that you've heard about it, you can identify it pretty darn easily. If you can't, there's a bunch of characteristics that you need to know that are primary markers of that infantile adult behavior. A sense of omnipotence, which is believing you should control everything. Is there an inability to accept any frustration? Is there? And definitely a compulsion to do everything in a rush, from thought straight to action, impulsivity, thought to action, not thought, feeling, and action. So let's look at a couple of these traits and see if any strike a nerve or remind you of someone that you know. Firstly, um, you'll frequently clash with or manipulate authority figures to get your own way. You seek approval so intensely that you lose your own authentic identity. You become an actor, a clown, a monkey, jumping around, having tantrums. You might make first grade impressions, but you never can follow through. It doesn't last very long. So things can go smoothly for a while in relationships, but what I call distrust comes in and they never, ever last. Why? Because king and queen babies can't handle criticism. They generally have addictive personalities driven by extreme highs and extreme lows. They treat everyday difficulties like life or death catastrophes. And this is very, very important if you've got a king or queen baby in your life or as a client or whatever. Get out of the crises. There's no crisis. I keep telling people, I can get to work on a Monday and there's an absolute crisis or catastrophe. And what'll it be about? It'll be about confusion, blame, someone else didn't do this or that. Total black and white, right or wrong, all or nothing. Absolutes that create an absolute crisis about the smallest of things. And people don't even seem to notice that the crisis doesn't even exist. So at the end of the day, binary thinking, abandonment fears, fears of failure, constant need for validation, um, that low tolerance for vulnerability and intimacy, um, by this distraction and blaming and denial, is really relational manipulation. So this is what king and queen babies and the archetype represents. So the scared child behind the mask is a subject that helps us understand that the king or queen baby requires looking beneath the charming, demeaning exterior that doesn't last long, but it's there. So beneath every manipulative or abusive ego response does lie a scared, lonely, and shamed child, shadow, persona. When this inner child hears the word no, an internal voice immediately misinterprets the boundary as confirmation of being inherently bad or unlovable. They cannot stand father figures, authority figures, and so on for that very, very reason. So, to protect this vulnerable core from any further pain, the personality constructs elaborate defense mechanisms and the false myths that we represent to the world come out. And in the paradigm process, we call that the actor. Um, so, a fatal combination of rage, substances, and ego highs, all of these, the terrible trio can come out. And when low self-worth and infantile ego combine with that emotional rage, drama, and then add to it mood-altering substances, alcohol, prescription medication, uh, dope, in terms of marijuana, one of the worst for a king or queen baby. Just makes the rageaholic far, far worse, and the low moods or the sulks thereafter more profound. The surge of power experienced during one of their emotional explosions or a chemical high briefly mimics the absolute comfort, invulnerability, and security of the womb. When you rage, you take control in an absolute split second. So the king and queen baby becomes addicted not only to the chemical behavior, and this is important, but to the high of absolute egoic control. And in the paradigm process, that's number one. We let go of the controller and recover that sense of self-love that's actually missing. The abandoned self can be soothed and loved. And that's what needs to happen psychologically and emotionally speaking. Over time, really, this cycle just destroys value systems. It destroys self-love, empathy. It burns out healthy coping mechanisms and leads to deep psychological exhaustion that the person is trapped in. It's that victim position. 1 minute I'm a persecutor, then I'm a rescuer, then I'm a victim. And all those three positions are victim positions. And victims are violent, volatile people. They really are. When you act like and you think you're a victim, you become a victimizer. You become volatile and you attack. Um, so now let's talk about how to get out of this. Um, Reparenting, transformation, healing, psychotherapy, um, working on the shadow, whatever you want to call it. Recovery begins when we become sick and tired of being sick and tired. When the frantic scheming, the emotional turmoil and isolation collapse, that infantile ego finally reaches a breaking point. And look, with my 25 years in counseling and therapy, it takes a ton of time, a ton of help for people to even become aware that they are in this cycle. They genuinely see themselves as the victim, while others, even the world, that's how bad the ego is, the entire world can be bad, um, to keep this lie going. So hitting bottom is not always the end. It's a spiral. It's an essential doorway, though, to genuine transformation, this hitting of the bottom. But when they're there, you genuinely have an enabler who, softens that landing and buys into the drama and the distrust, and actually also starts pointing at other people and saying, well, that institution's to blame, that therapist's to blame. That's why a lot of therapists don't want to work with king or queen babies. In fact, also, they are tending not to want to work with borderlines, with histrionics, people in the cluster B category, because it's not worth it. The bad press, the blaming, the chaos and crises are just not worth the couple of $100 that these therapists get. So they actually, a lot of therapists, unfortunately, do avoid helping these people, and the applications go to the bottom of the pile. If you're working with the NHS and so on, it happens. It's something that's commonly known out there. So how do we treat this? How do we sort of get a path to transformation going? Well, there's a couple of ways, and one of them is to become aware, obviously, and shift from I can't to we can. In other words, healthy connection. Surrendering the king or queen baby means abandoning the illusion, the absolute nonsense that you must run the universe alone and be that victim. So healing happens in connection, accepting the guidance of professionals, of therapists and coaches, family, people who do have their lives together, people who are emotionally regulated. That's who the king and queen baby have to follow, because, I call it step zero. If you want what those normies or normal people have, you become willing to take the same steps that they do. So inner reparenting is going to be very, very important, rather than attacking or denying that scared child within. True recovery involves stepping into the role of loving, of course, wise parenting of yourself, and growing up, owning up, and showing up. In quiet contemplation, we learn to meet our inner pain with love, with compassion, and then learning how to set boundaries from that demanding ego that never shuts up, while at the same time offering comfort and unconditional self-acceptance to that vulnerable self, is a very good way to come back from the hell of being a king or queen baby. And you're going to have to cultivate true humility. You're going to have to get that ego down, get rid of it. EGO, edging God out. You're going to have to get rid of it. Only the meek will inherit the earth, and only the meek will inherit peace and calm. Humility is not feeling low or inferior at all. It's the recognition of the quality that you're not superior or inferior to anyone else, but humility allows you to become teachable, flexible, and open to continuous growth. All those things are nowhere near what a king or queen baby is about. They literally have to hit rock bottom after rock bottom until they're willing to even accept the help that's given to them. So, of course, you can lead a horse to the water, but you can't make it drink. If you or anyone you know are struggling with the king or queen baby archetype, get help. Visit our center. do our programs, use the paradigm process to get rid of the 10 masks of your persona that keep the king or queen baby trapped and running the show, and learn the 10 pathways back to your sacred, authentic self. Namaste.